There we go. There we go. Okay.
There's no sound.
No, I fixed it. Just give it a second, get caught up. I was muted.
Okay.
All right, sorry about the sound issues there. We got it fixed though. Um, so we are in Acts chapter 21 and starting in verse 37. So to recap, and then we didn't finish this out because this part of Acts 21 rolled into the beginning of Acts chapter 22. So I wanted to get everything together. So we stopped at 36 last week. And just to recap, Paul has said his goodbyes to the elders in Corinth, and he's made his way to Jerusalem. He went over to Jerusalem, greeted the brothers there, and while he was there, he was doing what he normally does. And he was spotted by some Jews from, let's see, from the province of Asia, as Paul was in the temple preaching and teaching about Christ being the Messiah. And so they arrested him. They stirred up a big crowd like they always do, and they arrested him. And uh, they formed well, before they arrested him, these Jews stirred up a big riot. This mob came, grabbed hold of him. They were trying to kill him, but was such an uproar that it grabbed the attention of the Roman guards. The Roman guards came and arrested Paul, and the text says they had to pick him up and carry him for his own safety because even while they were escorting him, this mob was beating him and hitting him. So to keep him safe and then ascertain what was going on, the Roman guards picked him up. Verse 33 says, the commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains, then asked who he was and what he had done. Now, before all this happened, I want to touch on one thing that we talked about. And back at Paul's arrival in Jerusalem, and in starting in verse 20, it says when they heard, let me pull it up on the screen here for you. Excuse me. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, you see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that there is no truth to these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decisions that they should abstain from the food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. We talked about this vow a little bit last week, and I've done a little bit more research on it. And everything that I can come up with, and from what I have been able to ascertain about this vow that they took, where they shaved their heads, was a vow called the Nazir or the Nazarite vow. So, what is a Nazir? a Nazir, which is derived from the word Nazarite, is a person who decides to take upon him or herself a vow to live a strict and holy lifestyle. Chief among the Nazarite laws is that the Nazir is not allowed to drink wine, cut one's hair, or come into close contact with the dead. The Nazir would end his or her term by bringing a sin offering to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem during that era, or during that time. The first time we read about this is in Numbers chapter 6. I reached out to a Jewish rabbi that lives in Missoula, and him and I have been talking back and forth over the last week or so. And I asked him about this because in the text here in Acts, we see that Paul and these four men shave their head. And Paul's told to pay for their expenses to shave their head. Take these men, join in their purification rite, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. But reading the Nazarite vow in Numbers chapter 6, I asked the rabbi, I said, "Good morning, Rabbi. During my studies, I've come across the Nazarite vow, Numbers 6, 1 through 21. And I asked him, was it customary when a person would take one of these vows for them to shave their head prior to taking the vow? Because we see that the shaving of the head was important enough for them to note here in the text. But if we read the vow in Numbers chapter 6, you're not supposed to cut your hair once you've taken this vow." And so I found that very interesting. Rabbi Vogel, who I've been talking with, said, "Great question. The short answer would be not necessarily, but perhaps some would have done so for practical reasons, as a Nazir is forbidden to cut his or her hair." So it could have been that they shaved their heads, one, to signify that they're starting to take this vow as an outward sign. And then go through the purification rites, and then everyone would know. And so the other thing is that they were not allowed, there were certain things upon this vow they were not allowed to do. Let's see here. Okay, sorry. I lost my notes. Here it is. So they could not partake of alcohol or even any fruit that grew off the vine, not even the skins. Generally, I'm reading from an article about the Nazir from Chabad.org. It says, generally speaking, the Nazir undertake a vow of abstinence for a specific amount of time. He or she did not specify. It is assumed that the period lasted for 30 days. Male or female Jews can become Nazarites, but non-Jews cannot. The vow apply in all times. If a person were to take a Nazarite vow in the present era, he must observe it forever, because we do not currently have a temple to offer sacrifices when the vow is concluded. Basically, they would have to abstain from alcohol, from being in the presence of a dead body, from eating grapes or even the skin of grapes, and they were not allowed to cut their hair. So it was a sign of separating oneself from the rest of worldly society. And it was a vow that was sacred and made between that person and God the Father, Adonai. um, and it was set for certain days. Um, from what I've been able to read and study, it could be as short as 7 days, as long as 30 days, even into years, depending on the vow and the reason for the vow. So, just some little background there. One other thing that I found in my studies of this is once the Nazarite was completed, when that day or that time period ended, and they completed their vow, their time length of the vow, they would shave their head and offer the hair that they had shaved off at the end of the vow as a burnt offering as well. So there is that little bit, just kind of bringing more context into the scriptures that we're reading here. So, speaking of scriptures, let's get into tonight's scripture. All right, so we are in Acts chapter 21, and we are going to start in verse 37. Let me pull it up here on the screen. Here we go. So Paul's been arrested. He's been secured by the guards. He's been chained. And so backing up, I'm going to start in verse 33. The commander came up, arrested him, and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some of the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." All right, verse 37. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started the revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak to them in Aramaic, they became very quiet. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, brought up in the city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison. As the high priest and all of the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say unto me, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' I asked. 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. 'What shall I do, Lord?' I asked. 'Get up,' the Lord said, and go into Damascus. There you will be told all that you have been assigned to do.' My companions led me by the hand into Damascus, because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me. He was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, 'Brother Saul, receive your sight.' And at that very moment I was able to see or I was able to see him. Verse 14. Then he said, the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all the people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of your martyr, Stephen, was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. The Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So Paul, for his defense, gives his personal testimony. He gives his story of how he came to know Christ through his personal encounter on the road to Damascus. He also drops names, if you will, to validate and give credibility to his story. He tells them, I was a Jew of Jews. I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. I had letters from the high priest to go and arrest these people. I had the authorization to go, travel abroad, and persecute, throwing people in prison, men and women, it didn't matter, who followed this way. And then he talks about what happened on the road to Damascus, where him and his companions were engulfed in a bright light. And where this light blinded him, but not his traveling companions. And how he had a personal encounter with Christ. So for his defense, he's using his own personal testimony. You know, and as I read this, I think about, as those of us who are followers of the way, who are Christ followers, I don't know about you, but there have been times where I have faced nothing on this level of persecution, but I have faced some personal persecution for being a Christian, for being a Christ follower, for holding strong to my faith when it wasn't socially acceptable. And sometimes I've used the word and the Bible to defend my faith. But the things that I have found when I'm talking with people that is most effective is not necessarily anything from Scripture right away, but my own personal testimonies. Why is it personally that I follow Christ? Why is it that I hold so fast to the standards and the way of living that we find in these ancient writings? And I can't speak for other people. I can only speak for myself. But I look back at everything that God has done in my life, and there are some things that I cannot account for other than they are miraculous. And I find that often when I'm having discussions with people who don't believe, or they ask me, well, why do you believe? Why do you believe this is true? You know, why do you hold so fastly to this? I tell them. I look at certain things in my life that have happened that have no other explanation than divine intervention, than divine timing. And I find that to be very effective. And we see that Paul is doing the same thing here. He's just got mobbed, beaten. He's being arrested for causing a disturbance. And even while he was under the protection of the guards, he was still getting beat. And he spoke to them in their native tongue of Aramaic. And instead of going back and throwing in their faces, this Jesus whom you crucified, he says, let me tell you why I was a Pharisee and why now I'm a follower of Christ. And he gives his testimony as his defense. And when I read things like this, it helps me, and I hope it helps you. We should not be afraid to share our own personal experiences and our own personal stories of what Christ has done in our lives with other people. Because that's the way we connect with others. And that is a good starting point that we can then start teaching them a little bit here and there about what the Bible says. The Bible in its entirety is an overwhelming, miraculous document, or combination of documents. I have never read it from cover to cover. I've tried several times to just go from beginning all the way through. It is a very daunting task. And even just doing studies where we're taking it one book at a time and chapter by chapter and section by section and verse by verse, even doing this way, there's a lot of times where at the end of this study, I'm just, wow, that was heavy. Because there are things here, even though I have gone over them several times in my life, that the Spirit just saturates me with. And I see things like this, and it helps to encourage me to be like Paul and share my testimony when the option is given. Now, notice also, he asked the guard for permission. Being that he was empowered by the Holy Spirit, he could have just taken command of the situation. But he showed submission to the authority, the earthly authority that he was under too. And he goes about, he establishes who he is, where he was born and where he was raised and who he studied under and everything. And then he segued his story. And then he tells them, this is what my mission is from God. I was told by one of God's people, I'm going to the Gentiles. All right, let's continue on into verse 22. Let's see here. All right. Let me pull it up here. The crowd listened to Paul until he said this. Then they raised their voices and shouted, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. Man, that is just pure hatred. That is pure hatred. They listened to him. They took in his testimony. And look at this. They said, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. Wow. Things like this are just kind of hard to grasp for me. I can think of a handful of people right off the top of my head that have done evil, vile, horrendous things, murdered people and taken their innocence and all these other things that we see in the news every day. And here's a man just preaching that Christ is the Messiah, and the crowd here in Jerusalem says he's not fit to live. Let's continue on. Let's just, man, the hatred that I just grip out of that is it's it's almost too much, you know. All right, let's continue. Verse 23. As they were shouting and throwing off their cloaks and flinging dust into the air, the commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting at him like this. As they stretched him out to flog him, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and reported it. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "This man is a Roman citizen." The commander went to Paul and asked, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes, I am," he answered. Then the commander said, "I had to pay a lot of money for my citizenship. But I was born a citizen," Paul replied. Those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. The commander himself was alarmed when he realized that he had put Paul, a Roman citizen, in chains. So, this is a very important thing here. And Paul, so there were two different kinds of Roman citizens. There were those who were born into Rome, and there were those who migrated or came from other places. You had to buy your citizenship. And one of the other things is, if you were a Roman citizen, you had certain protections. Like, you could not just be flogged and then interrogated. No, you had to go to a trial before any kind of punishment like this could be dispensed. And Paul knew this, being that he was a Roman citizen. But notice what the commander said first. The commander ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. He directed that he be flogged and interrogated in order to find out why the people were shouting. So they weren't just going to question him. They were going to beat him and then question him, because there was a crowd here that wanted to kill him, and the Roman guards didn't know why. So they strip Paul down. They attach him over this, generally it'd be like a block or a big stone they would attach him to. They'd strip him down to next to nothing to beat him. And it says, as they stretched him out, Paul said to the centurion standing there, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty?" He drops the Roman card. And this puts the entire interrogation into a frenzy. Because now they know that if they flog him, or even the fact that he has been stretched out, could land all of them in a worse situation than what Paul's in, per Roman law. And that's why everyone stopped and they ran to the commander. And it says in verse 29, those who were about to interrogate him withdrew immediately. They're like, we have no part in this. So, Paul, being a Roman citizen, used this to his advantage to spare himself from getting flogged. He'd probably thought to himself, I've been beaten and imprisoned so many times, I'm in a position where I can spare myself. And it also gives him a little bit more leeway in what is to come. So let's get back to Scripture. Verse 30, this is Paul before the Sanhedrin. The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being, the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priest and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Let's go ahead and get into chapter 23. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day." At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, called out to the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel had spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." So, Paul is preaching in the synagogues, as is his mission to do. He's recognized by a Jew who's in Jerusalem for whatever reason from the Asia province, stirs up a riot. He's beaten, and the riot is so large that it grabs the attention of the Roman guards. The Roman guards come, arrest him, and as they're taking him into the barracks, he's still getting hit by this mob, so they pick him up and carry him. He's put into chains. He's ordered by the commander to be flogged and questioned. And then Paul drops the Roman card. Hey, is this legal for you to do this to a Roman citizen who hasn't even been found guilty of anything yet? This sends the guard into a panic, and they pull him before the Sanhedrin. And so he's standing there before the Sanhedrin, which is teachers and priests of the law. But you have two different groups here. You have Pharisees and Sadducees. Pharisees believe in a resurrection of the dead. They believe in spirits and angels and demons. The Sadducees do not. So Paul sits there and says, "Look, I have fulfilled my mission from God with a clean conscience to this very day, from the start of my mission to today." And this annoys the high priest, who orders Paul to be hit in the mouth. And Paul says to him, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there and judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck." He's saying you're a double standard person. You accuse me of violating the law, but you're violating the law by yourself by ordering that someone hit me in the mouth. And those who were standing near Paul got up and they insulted, and they rebuked him for, insulting the high priest. And then Paul, in this thing, says, "Look, I'm on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." And he knows that there's Sadducees here, and that this is going to cause this great debate. But what he said isn't false. He is there. He is under arrest for preaching the good news of Christ. And through the good news of Christ, we have the hope of a resurrection of life after this physical life that we're in. But he's ended up taken away again. And because it angers these people so much that they, in this court, are tearing at Paul, and so the Roman guards have to take him back in again. Let's go ahead and finish out chapter 23. Something else too. After he was taken away, it says the following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you've testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." He tells Paul, "You're going to Rome. You're going to testify about me there in Rome." So here is Acts 23, starting in verse 12. The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. Now, these are people who were supposed to be God's people, God's representatives, His chosen. But this doesn't seem very godlike or His nature to plot to kill people. And it says more than 40 men were involved in this plot. Verse 14. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with his warning, "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusations had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charges against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day they let the cavalry go on with him, while they returned to the barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." And he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So, quite a lot is going on here in chapter 23. So, going back from 22, Paul's arrested, After a mob is stirred up, he gives his testimony to the crowd as his defense. And this just angers them all the more, and they want him killed. He's getting ready to get flogged and interrogated when he drops that he's a Roman citizen, which turns everything up on its head, because now he's protected under the laws of Rome. And he has to be found guilty of a charge before he can be flogged or even questioned. So, Sanhedrin is called. This is the court of the priests, the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the elders and teachers of the law. And he gives his defense that, hey, I'm here because I'm preaching about a hope of resurrection. This causes a debate between the Pharisees and Sadducees. And Paul is again taken back to the barracks for his own safety. Then we learn that Paul's nephew is in the Sanhedrin, or at least a part of it some way, because he hears about this plot. Maybe he was a Pharisee as well, following in his uncle's footsteps. Excuse me. And hears about this plot that 40 people have taken an oath to not eat or drink anything until Paul is killed. And that they were going to have the Sanhedrin call to get more accurate information about his case. And as he was on his way there, they were going to ambush Paul and the people who were escorting him to kill Paul. His nephew gets word of this. He brings it to Paul. Paul sends for the centurion and has the centurion take him to the commander. The commander, knowing that Paul's a Roman citizen, said, well, we can't let this happen. He even said in his letter that he finds no charges to put him to death or even imprison him, but sends him instead to Governor Felix in Caesarea. So then Paul is basically placed under protective custody in Herod's palace until his accusers arrive to bring these charges against him. So it's still a prison. It's just a little swankier being in a palace than, in a prison. So we know that Paul's eventually going to end up in Rome, because that's what God had told him, that you're going to testify in Rome about me. And Paul is fearlessly pushing forward and continuing his missions that he's been given. Excuse me. So, I know we only said we were going to go into 22, but we went into 23 as well, just to kind of progress, because, it's one thing is when you really get into it, I try and keep these things to one chapter, a broadcast, but it's like reading, or it's like watching a movie and having to pause it as it's coming to its conclusion. But there's a lot that we can draw from this. Be fearless in sharing your testimony. When you face even overwhelming opposition, keep a cool head. The other thing that we have to learn, or that we can learn from all this, is that in all things, we just have to put our trust in the mission that God's given to us and trust in His plan. It's not always bright, it's not always beautiful, it's messy, it's ugly, it's painful sometimes, And it's hard. I've said this once, I've said it again, and I've heard it echoed by many other people. Ministry is messy, and it's hard. And when you are doing God's work, your life gets turned up on its head. And you would think that, hey, I'm doing God's work. It shouldn't be like this. But it is. I fall into that sometimes. Life gets heavy and it gets hard and things go wrong and we get frustrated, but we just got to hold on to our faith. And we just got to hold on to the one who has always been with us. So that is Acts 21 and 37 through Acts 23. Yeah, 37 through Acts 23. And next week is Acts 24, where Paul's trial before Felix. And then let's see. We've only got a few more chapters left. We got 24, 25, 26, and 27. So we've only got 4 more chapters left in the book of Acts. And it's going to get interesting from here. I mean, it's already been an interesting journey that we've gone through. What I would like you all to start thinking about what book you'd like to go through next in the Bible. Think about it. We've got 4 weeks before we really have to decide that. But start thinking about what book would you really like to dive into. We've already gone through Hebrews. We've gone through Romans. We've gone through Acts. So think about it. Put it on the comments on the video here or in our group chat. Let me know. Questions, comments, anything about tonight's study that really stood out to you? My friend Dingo said, dude, that's the best time to pause a movie. Sometimes it can be really frustrating. I've got 3 kids that still live at home, and we try and have family movie nights on Fridays, and one of the things I kind of struggle with is the movie's really getting good and we have to pause it because someone has to get up and go to the bathroom, or they want to go get a drink or something. And it's like, no, it's getting good. Just hold it. Bear with it. But, it's building the anticipation towards the end. And, it's going pretty good. So anyway, I'm going to check for other comments. I have one comment for Revelations. I have attempted before to read the book of Revelation. And it's a daunting task. There's a lot in there that I don't understand. And there is a lot in there that is symbolic. But there's a lot that we can learn there. So I'll definitely put it on the maybe list. Definitely something I would want a lot of extra study notes from people who have better knowledge than I am. So, all right. As always, the same request I make at the end of each one of our Bible studies is that please like and subscribe to the Bible study page. Share this with people you know. The more likes we get on YouTube, the easier it is to find us. And the more you share it, the more we can fulfill our mission that we find in Matthew 28:18 through 20, which tells us to go into all the world and teach. So that does it for me. I hope you all have a blessed week, and Lord willing, we will be back again for another broadcast of our Bible study to get into Acts chapter 24. Good night, everyone.